I've been gallivanting around the Baltic for the last 2 weeks, but I'm very, very glad to be back because I've been looking forward to this particular talk with relish. Dr. Nicholas Gamble I've known for many years, but he's actually been teaching art history in the University of Oxford for 40 years and is extremely knowledgeable. He has a particular interest in Byzantine and medieval art, and an even more particular interest in the art connected with St. Francis of Assisi. I gather that the slides that we're going to see were brought back from Assisi, so that's great. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy this. I'm sure you will. I can't do anything about the weather, the sunlight, which is glorious, but I hope you'll be able to see adequately. Do move up nearer if you think that's likely to help. So with no more ado, I would like to say welcome to Nicholas Gamble.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this will be a not ignoble penultimate lecture. This what I think has been quite splendid series and magnificently organised by Georgie, who seems to whistle computers and projectors and goodness knows what else by just lifting telephones. I would like to try use, above all, the fresco cycle in the upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi to show the development of his life. And I have over the last week or so been studying some of the original sources, one of which I'm sure many of you may know, the Fioretti, the little father of St. Francis, which is probably the most charming invitation of the springtime to Franciscan movement in all its simplicity and joy. But more importantly, perhaps, is the second chronicle of Tommaso di Celano, another Franciscan, who was commissioned by the chapter, the general chapter of the order, about 20 years after the saint's death, to gather together all reminiscences of the saint, which he used as primary material for his account of the life of St. Francis. There's also a later, slightly later, Vita by St. Bonaventure, which, however, tends to be, I think, in some ways, rather theological to St. Francis, and also, more importantly, it lacks the literary charms of both Tommaso and the author, whoever they were, the little flowers. But it's full of very interesting reflections, but tends rather to reduce the life to a standard hagiography and lacks, I think, the charm. Never mind. So what I intend to do then is to, first of all, introduce you to the upper church at Assisi. And there, of course, in the lower church, possibly by a follower of Giotto, is the well-known full-length portrait, the head of the portrait, which I think is very suggestive and sensitive. Though it doesn't seem to look very much like the account of his appearance given by some of his early companions, who described him as not at all attractive, not particularly handsome at all, with rather short and slight in stature, much emaciated in his later life by his ascetic practices, the sheer hardship of his life, physical hardship, and having black hair and a sparse beard. Well, he's got a sparse beard, but he hasn't got black hair. He looks rather too well nourished. But the fact is that, like Christ himself, nobody really knows exactly what St. Francis looks like. In order to give some account of Franciscan iconography, the tradition of depictions of St. Francis and his life, one has the positive Embarras de Richesse, not only are there numerous narrative scenes stretching from the 13th to the early 14th, I should say, to well into the late modern period and beyond. But there are also lots of iconic images like this one, single-fronted portraits. And St. Francis very frequently appears, especially of course, but by no means only, in Franciscan churches as part of altarpieces and other images, frequently in particular in what we call sacri conversazione, holy conversations, which is the new Renaissance way of showing the Virgin and Child of Christ and so the saints with a symmetrical wing of saints disposed on either side of the central throne figure. And that even when it's not a Franciscan program, Francis frequently figures. But my interest today is in the life of St. Francis. Rather than cherry pick and attempt to do everything in Italy from the 14th to the late 16th century, I would like to concentrate on the earliest works I could find. Primarily those by an unknown master known as the Francis Master in the Upper Church. But also, I thought it would be good to go to Florence, where in the enormous Franciscan Basilica of Santa Croce, in one of the eastern chapels belonging to the Bardi family, Giotto himself was commissioned to paint a rather more abbreviated life of the saint. So that would be our second source. My third source is a very fine Pradella, that is 7 detached paintings from what must have been a very large altarpiece in Italy, probably in Siena, by the Sienese 15th century master Stefano di Giovanni Sassetta, who was working in the first half of the 15th century. Unfortunately, one of those disappeared but re-emerged in New York. But we have 7 up to date. Trying to make a list from the primary sources of the most important incidents in the life of the saint, I was struck that the choices among different artists vary considerably, and even in the fullest and earliest program, the one in the Upper Church by the so-called St. Francis Master, dated to the first quarter of the 14th century, certain interesting episodes like St. Francis' vision of the floating castle in the first stage of his conversion, Francis embracing the leper, and other things do not appear. So I used I found that 3 of these 7 panels in the National Gallery by Sassetta will fill in those gaps. And after I finished looking at the Upper Church, I hope there'll be time to show you the Francis cycle in the Bardi Chapel in Florence, and then the remaining panels from the Sassetta altarpiece in London. Well, St. Francis was born. Sorry, I hope there's a date. Was born in 1182, the son of a very rich and prosperous merchant in fine stuff silks and taffetas and so forth, and was brought up as a rather cosseted and working young man. Celano describes him indeed as extremely self-indulgent and thinking only of enjoying himself, though he does admit that even in his rather rakish youth, he was extraordinarily generous, and not only to his friends. His earliest hopes were of glory in a military career, but here he faltered because in a local skirmish between the Sienese and the Perugians, he was taken for prisoner and languished in jail in Perugia for a whole year, during which he had an opportunity to reflect on his situation. But before I get to this, perhaps I should just show you one or two pictures of the mise en scène, the actual physical setting in the upper church at the Great Basilica, the Gran Convento at Assisi. It seems, and perhaps ironic, that this poverello, this poor little man, this little brother of Christ, who had renounced all material possessions and lived a life of what we would today find crushing, deliberate, voluntary poverty, should now be entombed under the largest and most splendid of the medieval churches of Italy. This superb erection is in a style highly influenced by French Gothic. The Gothic, of course, originated in the Ile-de-France and was regarded for a long time by Italians as an alien style. They called it lo stile francese, the French manner. And it seems most likely that it was erected by mainly French-made master masons, assisted no doubt by their Italian apprentices. It's on a very large scale. It's one of the biggest medieval, non-cathedral churches in Italy, and it consists of two large single-nave churches with an eastern arm, one on top of the other. Here we're looking towards the altar of the upper church, and you'll notice that it employs the most simple and technically less demanding of the many modes of Gothic vaulting, a quadripartite vault which divides each square bay into four triangular parts in the roof. And those which serve to lead the weight down onto the engaged shafts in the wall. There's the plan. There are no aisles, a very wide nave, a very spacious interior of four bays terminating in an eastern transept without any chancel. The crossings is the chancel in effect, and a single apse, which I'm afraid is cut off in the picture. And this interior, upstairs and down, is completely lined with fresco cycles. And in each bay, in the center of each bay, there is a large window which is filled with stained glass. It is the best preserved, I think, and in many ways the most impressive artistic and architectural achievement of its age in Italy. Two artists are at work in the upper church, above another unknown master known as the Santa Cecilia master, who did a series of Old Testament scenes. And then below we see a continuous sequence in roughly chronological biographical order of the life of St. Francis, which Vasari, in his second edition of the Vita degli Artisti, ascribes to Giotto without, I think, sufficient knowledge, because nowadays, except for some very old-fashioned and elderly Italian art historians who feel it's a matter of national pride to retain the authorship of Giotto, a man who everyone has heard of, is now simply known as, I think, all Transalpine scholars as the St. Francis Master, or the Master of the Life of St. Francis. The media from which he came was very possibly Rome, where in the late 13th century, Cavallini was beginning to work in a monumental manner which implied a new sense of the observation of light and perspective and the form of a rhyme. His best work is to be found in two churches in Trastevere on the south bank of the Tiber. And after the papacy moved to Avignon in 1305, these chaps were out of work. And it seems most likely then that persons in his circle, his pupils, may have come to Assisi, where this spectacular opportunity of a major commission awaited them. And proceeded to spend, well, we've worked out roughly at least 20 years to create what you can now see. In the lower church, in the slightly later 14th century, Sienese masters such as Simone Martini and the brothers Lorenzetti, Pietro and Ambrogio were working to good effect downstairs. We've worked out how long it might have taken by careful examination of what the Italians call legionati. That's how much work you can do on a wall in a day. And if you examine very carefully using modern equipment, you can work out where the drawings are. And if you put all those giornati together, you can roughly work out that it took somewhere around 2 years, allowing for periods of pause between the people didn't work on Sundays. There must be periods when they had to go into town and buy equipment and materials, and so about at least 2 years, provided that we assume it was done as a single campaign, which I think we may. And this shows, that shows the scale of the frescoes, 3 in each bay. And if you compare the height of the fresco, or one of them, to the size of an average church chair, you can see them down at the bottom, you can see that the figures are almost life-size. This is a truly spectacular program in terms of everything, its scale, its size, its artistic quality, and its originality. Because for obvious reasons, this being the prototype Vita sample, the life biographical sample, there were no precedents. There might have been individual pious images of St. Francis's face, but no celebratory life cycle, and here we have it. So we assume cooperation between learned friars in the convento itself, next door, the monastery, and possibly theologians appointed by the bishop, and of course the experienced artists, to try and work out how each and every one of these scenes from the life of St. Francis would be realized in visual terms. Well, now, as I mentioned, St. Francis's earliest aspiration as a lively young man about town with plenty of money to spend was a brilliant career as a knight. He looked forward to glories in military campaigns. But one day, he while sleeping in prison at Perugia, had a dream of a great palace castle floating in the air with military banners. They look like St. George's crosses, actually, but gaily floating in the breeze, which he took initially as an indication of his future military glory. But an inner voice told him that that shall be spiritually wrought. In other words, that such praise and such achievements as he might have will be spiritual ones, and that he will be a soldier of Christ. Numerous other admonitory dreams followed, and he became clearly more and more dissatisfied and conscience-stricken about his self-indulgent way of life. And finally, when praying before the crucifix in the dilapidated church on the edge of Assisi of San Damiano, he heard a voice from the cross. The crucified spoke to him, saying, "Repair my church, repair my church, which, as you see, is much dilapidated." And then he went to his father's warehouse. He took out some of the richest materials, bales of silk and so forth, and sold them in order to buy the masonry and so forth, the mortar, to rebuild the church himself, possibly helped by some friends. And very soon afterwards, he continued these architectural restoration efforts at another ruined chapel, which is then in the woods on the plain at the bottom of the hill on which Assisi sits, which is known as the Porziuncula, originally Santa Maria degli Angeli, Our Lady of the Angels. The little portion, what became the headquarters of Francis and his brethren, remains now in some ways the mother church of the order. Though it was simply little more than a stone hut, totally devoid of any architectural interest. And I often wonder, when one goes there today, it's been enclosed within a gigantic and I think exceedingly vulgar Baroque edifice. I wonder what he would make of it. I think he would be absolutely horrified. And in fact, the little stone hut, largely hardly big enough to take 10 friars, is still standing in the midst of all this Baroque splendor or display. And the contrast is very, I think, eloquent. So initially, of course, he took it that Christ crucified was commanding him simply to repair the church, or churches. But it became clear to him that it was, in fact, a much more widely ranging and exigent form. When he got home, his father, who appears to be a very hard and irascible person, simply lost control and became utterly enraged. And it was at this point that St. Francis decided that he had to make a clear break with his indulgent youth, his way of life, and in a very dramatic scene, he sought the protection of the local bishop, who agreed that the father and son should meet in the square in front of the cathedral. And in a dramatic gesture, St. Francis divested himself of all his smart clothes and flung them at his father's feet as a symbol of his radical and irrevocable break with the past and his rejection of the authority of his father and his embrace of a new life dedicated to poverty and service of others. We see the indignant father in yellow on the left, and on the right St. Francis being decently clothed around the waist by the bishop's cloak. The bishop looks mildly embarrassed about what's happening. Even then he lived in what are simple clothes before he started to attract his first disciples and moved definitively into what we now take as the Franciscan brown frock. And you see he continuously gave away what monies he retained from his father. Here we see him giving his purse to a poor man who's prostrating in gratitude on the floor. That's a little heap of green, bottom right. And interestingly, the church, which is one of the first in this part of Italy to be built all'antica after the antique like a Roman temple, with a pediment resting on columns. And the next door Gothic church. They are both, well, that is part of the same church actually, excuse me. This church, known as Santa Maria Sopra Minerva, because it's built on the site of a Roman temple to that goddess, is still looking exactly as you see it in the picture. And here we see him giving his cloak to a beggar in the countryside outside the town. A fine orange-looking garment. So he's deliberately divesting himself of all, absolutely every possession, all money and even his own clothes. So slowly he begins to acquire followers, and initially he included some aristocratic youths of Assisi, and he clothes them in a brown habit. He makes it very clear that that is the only garment, and originally the hood or capuce was attached, so all one piece, to the back of the neck, not the small cable which friars of the simpler mediums wear today. And one undergarment and a rope, not a leather belt, but a white cord around the waist. Numbers grew remarkably quickly, so much so that his next move was to go to Rome to seek papal approval of the nascent order. According to St. Bonaventure, this was granted after a remarkable dream of Innocent III, who saw, there is St. Francis conversing with the Pope, St. Francis on the left, Innocent on the right, with cardinals, some of whom in those days wore blue, not only red. And there you see the Pope in bed, still wearing his tiara, in case you wondered who it was. And you see a rather insouciant St. Francis, apparently effortlessly holding up the top in paper of the Lateran. So there were numerous troubles going on in the church at the time, which I needn't go into now, but it was an anxious time for the Pope, and he thought, well, here are some extremely energetic young men who may be able to help me to prop up the slightly sagging fabric, which is our church. And then 3 years later, Innocent dies, and his successor, Honorius III, is visited again by Francis. Following the instructions of the first Pope, Innocent, he set about writing a simple rule. And there you see him presenting it to the Pope in the Vatican Palace. You see that by now St. Francis is not coming by himself, but has behind him a clutch of his brethren, all in brown habits. And this confirmation of the rule, of course, canonically turned what had been an informal religious brotherhood into one of the official orders of the Roman Church. And shortly afterwards, he had a vision on the road to Siena, in which 3 beautiful young ladies approached him. One of whom was Lady Poverty, and we see him now betrothing himself to her. The other ladies on either side of her, left and right, are Obedience, who has a yoke on her neck, and Chastity in white, carrying a towel. So at this point in his heart, St. Francis regards himself as committed, as like one might be in a marriage to poverty, who greets him with a great smile. She becomes his mystical bride, And in some images, but not this one, the same subject, you see him placing a ring on her finger. Next, we have a remarkable episode when St. Francis, this is 20 years later, St. Francis is moved to go and preach Muslims in Egypt, which at that time had been invaded by Austrian-German troops of the Emperor. So there was some protection, but still it took some gumption, I think, to go and present himself unarmed before in the court of the Sultan, who was called Malik al-Khalid. And a real person, there's no doubt this is a historical incident, and who was very impressed by St. Francis's presentation, and also by his offer to prove the truth of his preaching by putting his hand in the fire, which of course was unscathed. So on the right you see the Sultan enthroned, various Oriental ministers of the crown that we see standing around the walls, and St. Francis is in the centre with his sermon notes in one hand, about to put his hand in the fire, the pot which is burning to the left of the picture. This is probably one of the most famous of all the episodes in his life, at least in popular imagination, of St. Francis preaching to the birds. And there's a charming account of it in the Fiorente. As we've heard in earlier lectures in this series, one should not regard St. Francis's love of birds and beasts as in any way sentimental. They're all part of the glory of creation. They are sentient beings which respond to the joy of existence, and they praise God by simply doing what they do, which in the case of birds, amongst other things, is singing. St. Francis solemnly begins to preach to a very large number of birds who came and settled in a couple of trees where he was staying at the time. And yeah, I turned to St. Anthony preaching to the fishes, that's never at all. Here we are. He saw by the roadside some trees on which rested an innumerable flock of birds. The sage was filled with wonder and said to his companion, "Wait on the road and I'll go and preach to my sisters the birds." He went into the field and began to speak to them. Immediately those in the trees flew down to him and all remained motionless until he ended, and even then did not depart until he blessed them. He told them, "My little sisters, you have received many things from God, your Maker, and you should praise Him everywhere. For He clothed you with double and triple plumage and given you freedom to fly wherever you wish." And so on. And after the end, all the birds began to open their beaks and stretch out their legs and reverently bow their heads to the ground, and then, with one accord, burst into song. Very charming. So you see the birds flying down from the tree onto the ground to listen to the saint, and behind him his companion, Brother Leo. I'm sorry, the light is getting worse, isn't it? That is, surprisingly, another very important animal incident, which is mentioned in all the literary accounts, is not in the Franciscan cycle of Assisi. So I pop in at this point one of the panels from Sassetta's altarpiece in the National Gallery. This is the incident of the wolf at Gubbio. This enormous beast had been terrorizing the townsfolk, had been stealing their livestock, and even attacking and killing various people. And when St. Francis arrived, they all appealed to him in despair. So courageously, without pause, he strides out into the wood where the wolf's lair is and offers him a pact. Brother Wolf would be fed by the townsmen provided he ceased terrorizing the city. And Sasetta shows him about to sign the treaty. He's even brought along a notary, I'm sorry, very hard to see, but as an official, to make an official document. He's sitting down on the left, out just by the city gate. And there you see St. Francis shaking the wolf's paw in ratification of this pact. If you go to Gubbio to this day, there's a very large portrait, sculpture of St. Francis and the wolf in the Piazza della Pace, appropriately named. Another very charming instance is that, well, I don't think we know exactly when St. Francis went to Reccio, which is up in the hills of Assisi, where there are today many Franciscan hermitages. He went up there to celebrate Christmas with his brethren, and had the idea of having made a life-size image of the Bambino, the Christ child, and putting it in a real manger, and bringing on a real ox and a real ass to feed on him. And everybody was filled with devotion. And that is why we have cribs in churches in Christian homes at Christmas to this day. I think this is happening in a church interior. You can see the back of the crucifix, which would have been over the rood screen. You can see Christ putting the child into bed in the manger, and some say that as he did so, it seemed to come alive. You can see the child's head is coming up as if it's a real baby and not just a rigid doll. There are many miracles ascribed to St. Francis, and it's interesting how these not only are as it were, himself as a speculum Christi, as a living mirror of Christ, but also he appears, as it were, to be a new Moses or even a new Elijah. On one occasion, when travelling through very arid, rocky country with two of his disciples, he was incredibly hot and everyone was parched with thirst, and the younger friar seemed to be about to faint. And what St. Francis then does is touch the rock with his stick, and out gushes a spring of pure water. One thinks of Moses bringing forth water for the parched and starving children of Israel in the passage across the wilderness into the promised land. And it's recorded in all of the sources, and on at least 3 occasions, when praying in a state of ecstasy, St. Francis was actually lifted up into the air. There we see him, as it were, floating in a little cloud, with Christ leaning up to heaven to greet him, to speak to him. I don't find this hard to believe, since many other things have been known to levitate. St. Teresa was often very embarrassed when inquired with her sisters that she suddenly irresistibly felt herself going up, and she had a burly sister sitting next to her who would grab her by the ankles and pull her back down again. The culmination of these wonders would happen in 2 years before the saint's death, when he retreated with his simple-minded but devoted disciple, Brother Leo, to the very apex of Mount Verna, which was given to him by the local law, the Baroni Chiuso, and as a place which the friars could use as a retreat whenever they needed to get away from the hassle of the world. And here he was received the actual marks of Christ crucified in his living flesh. Page 165. I think that the unknown authors of the Fioret must have had available, almost certainly Franciscans had available to them the depositions made at the papal court in the process of St. Francis's canonization. People who'd actually witnessed and verified the stigmata themselves, which included numerous friars, and also one of his most devoted lay disciples, the Lady Jacoba di Settesoli, who was a noblewoman who was given the privilege of washing his body after his death and could definitely swear to the existence of these 5 wounds. Excuse me. He used 2 hands with the books about just shut himself on me. I might say that stigmatization is not limited to St. Francis, and in recent years there have been examples. I was amazed when in my Dominican days I was working in a very young, very definitely, sort of workers' area on the edge of town in the parish, and I actually met a stigmatic woman on there. On the feast of the Holy Cross, that's Holy Cross Day, the 14th of September, the saint's fervour grew so strong in him that he became entirely transformed into Jesus through love and compassion. On the same morning, while he was thus inflamed by his contemplation, he saw a seraph with 6 shining fiery wings descend from heaven. This seraph drew near to St. Francis in swift flight, so that he could see him clearly and recognize that he had the form of a man crucified. His wings disposed in such a way that 2 stretched above his head, 2 spread in flight, and 2 covered his whole body. As St. Francis gazed on him, he was filled with great fear, and at the same time with huge joy, sorrow, and wonder. And it seemed to him that he was looking at the gracious face of Christ, who looked at him so kindly, that seeing him nailed to the cross, he felt infinite sorrow and compassion. And while he was gazing, it was revealed to him by God that he should in his flesh be transformed into the express likeness of Christ crucified, not by the kindling of the soul only, but by the living martyrdom of his body. Oh, sorry, have I gone too fast? Yes, there's the stigmatization. Did I move on too fast? Have you seen that?
Yes, you see that.
Yes. You see the rocky summit, where there's just a single hut. You see Brother Leo crouching down below. There is the rosy seraph, and you can see rays emanating from his, he is in the form of a winged Christ, with beams of light emanating from his 5 wounds, which imprint themselves into the body of St. Francis. Subsequently, for the last 2 years of his life, as a result of this, he suffered terrible pain, as you can imagine. And here is the scene of his death. On his deathbed, he called to him his first disciple, Brother Bernard, to whom he was utterly devoted, and asked him to kneel by his side. But pushing Brother Elias, who caused great dissension, which was to prove a terrible ongoing problem in the Franciscan order, by trying to mitigate the original rule of total the brotherhood into a sort of traditional monastic institution with endowments and property and so forth, all of which was expressly contrary to the saint's desires. He sort of crept in and knelt next to Brother Bernard. So the saint crossed his arms like this and put his hands with the wounds in the palms on top of both of their heads. And that is the Francis between the masters, those crossed arms with the wounds. And here we see what is both his funeral. You see some friars are vested and conducting the funeral. See one in the two in surplices and coats, three in surplices. A row of oblates who've just been tonsured on the left, holding candles. And there you see a doubting nobleman of Assisi who was brought in specifically to verify the reality of the stigmata. And he was taken back to be buried in what is now the Gran Convento in the lower church. And on the way they passed by the little church of San Damiano, which we recall he himself in his youth had personally restored, which he had been where he had enclosed his first female disciple, St. Clare. In this restored monastery they were enclosed. But St. Clare gave them all permission to come out and stand in front of the monastery as St. Francis's coffin passed, and you see them there lamenting. There are also pictures in the Assisi cycle, images of various alleged visions, which may or may not be historical if they are representing interior rather than exterior events. On one occasion, one of the brethren, that's one who's pointing upwards, saw an angel who indicated in heaven to him the large room and four small ones, which St. Francis and his very saintly companions would soon be occupying. And harking back to the story of Elijah, so Francis is not only a second Christ, but a second Moses and Elijah. Other brethren, three attested that they'd seen him shortly after his death, ascending into heaven in a fiery chariot, just like Elijah. It's a rather splendid, it looks like a farm cart. And he also, this was of course well attested, because there were so many friars of this chapter at Portiuncula, at least several dozen who attested that during their deliberations, when they were at a loss what to decide and prayed to St. Francis for his intercession and help, he actually manifested himself post-mortem. And that is the apparition at the chapter in Arles, in France, up in France. And finally, in this series, I finish with an image of St. Francis, glorified St. Francis in ecstasy, which is also by Sassetta. You may wonder about his fiery chariot, but I have no doubt myself that he is indeed glorified in heaven. Now, very quickly, just as tour d'horizon, you probably know that until post-war period, everybody believed what Vasari said, that indeed the frescoes in the other church are by Giotto. The reason why now almost no one believes this is because of stylistic grounds. The one absolute benchmark of authentic Giotto is his great series of paintings in Padua, in the Arena Chapel, which are regarded in some ways as his mature masterpiece. And they are so different in so many ways. If you want to look into this, I suggest you read the splendid and monumental history of Italian Renaissance art by Professor Frederick Hart, who will give you bibliographies to more detailed discussions. So Giotto has lost his glory at Assisi, but he remains pretty well unchallenged. There are some quibblers, and in the Bardi Chapel, as I said, of Santa Croce. Again, what would St. Francis have made of these enormous preaching houses, these grand Gothic fabrics that went up within a generation of his death? But they were essential to contain the enormous crowds that went to, they were like revivalist rallies in the Americas, enormous congregations you had to. And so the main thing, it's very similar, its architectural plan, isn't it, to the Convento of Assisi. It's another T-shaped building with a row of Eastern chapels, one of which on the top left and the north transept is the Bardi Chapel. View down the nave, you can see something of the scale of the basilica. And you see where the light is on the right. That is where you find the Franciscan cycle by Giotto, the Bardi Chapel. This is St. Francis renouncing his father and his wealth, with the bishop wrapping him up in his coat. That's a detail of his angry father and his family. This is him presenting his rule for confirmation to Pope Honorius III. Notice that by this time, by about 1320, one's getting a real sense of how to create perspectival space, to give a sense of three dimensions of the building. There is the saint preaching in front of the Sultan of Egypt with a nice orange bonfire in front of him and steadily looking Arabs and turbans. There is the stigmatization of St. Francis on Monte La Verna. You can clearly once again see the figure of Christ crucified with the 6 wings of the seraph and the rays coming out of the Christ wings into the feet and side of Francis. Here we have the death of St. Francis and his funeral all in one, lying on his deathbed, detailed. And there you see the doubting knight actually doing a St. Thomas and poking his finger into the wound in St. Francis' side. So it's also the verification of the stigmata. And there is the apparition of the glorified St. Francis in the chapter at Ars. And we've already, one stylistic point is how bulky and very physical Gothic people are. The figures of Assisi are much lighter and less heavy, less corporeal. Yes. So now the remaining, there's 7 panels in the Society in the National Gallery in Life of St. Francis. You've already seen 3 of them. So I think there are about 4 left. This is the renunciation of the father, who's coming forward with some energy. These pictures were painted in the 3rd quarter of the 15th century in Siena. You see the father wearing one of those hoopla turban-like headdresses in red on the left, and the naked, all but naked of St. Francis being protected by the bishop under the portico on the right. That is the confirmation of the rule, the Pope wearing his triple tiara on the right and kneeling friars on the left. Cardinals in scarlet. This is Francis preaching in front of the Sultan. The bonfire is very much in evidence. Very pleasant harmonies of gold, orangey gold and green. The stigmata, with Brother Leo quite visible as the witness of the event, bottom right. All in a rather nice, rather close tonal harmony of brown, reddish browns, representing the fiery seraph, the divine energies which are emanating from that heavenly form. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I've just finished within an hour, which is all out the ground. I hope very much that this has brought the life of St. Francis more clearly to your inner eyes. And if you have any questions, I think we can have them.
If there is anybody who'd like to make a comment or a question, please wait for me to bring the microphone to you.
Yes.
How is it original, at this period, for visions of Elijah?
Sorry, can you speak
Visions
into
of
the...
Elijah or Moses or Christ on the cross, is it usual for those to be depicted as part of a saint's life? So the
Saint's
connection between Elijah and Francis, Moses and Francis,
Or the Christ of
and
Christ?
Christ and Francis. Is that original with images?
It is not. I think it is, I've put it this way, very unusual,
Yeah.
if not unique. The people who refer to him as an outer Christmas in his own lifetime. Anyone else? Yes, there's a gentleman there.
Can you help me? I feel churches were built with some people who do without my notes. Pretty quick. When I read about this Sforza, I saw the name of Da Vinci associated with it.
No.
Is it recollected?
No connection whatsoever. I don't know why that should be.
Tell us a little more about the lady that you met with the stigmata. Did you mention you had actually met someone? Not long ago?
I met a stigmatic, yes I did. A very ordinary middle-aged lady. I don't think I should tell you too much. That it's not as unusual as you think. Well, I hope that was sufficiently clear. Yes, sir.
The first series in the upper church.
Yes, yes.
Do they come from a prototype for later?
Yes, they do.
The colours, etc., are very similar in geometry.
It's an amazing example, an instance of creating instant iconography, how to translate events in the human world into pictorial form.
So just remind me, what is
Remember, if you go to the life of Christ, you'll have thousands of precedents to use, but this is absolutely starting from scratch. And so inevitably the program in the upper church becomes something which is widely copied.
what was the title of that imagery? The one in the upper church and the geometry for the dead.
Oh, not very long. I mean, we think that probably the upper church was done in the first 20 years. Well, starting around 1307, after the papal court left for Avignon after 1305, but around 1307 to 1327 at Assisi. And Giotto was beginning to work in the Arena Chapel of Padua in the late 1320s, so they're one after another, really. It may be that he finished the Arena before he went to Florence, so it could be as late as 1345, 50. That's the Guardia Chapel. Sassetta is late 15th century, working in Siena. Do go and look at the Sassetta sequence in the National Gallery in the Sainsbury wing.
Let's do that.
Well, say so.
As it's past, I think we should stop. But on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you for a really wonderful, despite the sun, a really wonderful talk illustrated by these marvellous pictures.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is also say each time I'm here that any donations you could make to assist us with our expenses would be very gratefully received. And please come next week if you can to the final talk in this series, which will also be very different, but it will be also very, very good.
What is it? What's the subject?
It's Francis and the Papacy, yes.
Francis and the Papacy.
Which I think you can take. It just so happened that we launched this series just as the new Pope was elected, and not only was, he did insist actually that the name that he took was Francis of Assisi and not Francis Xavier, because he was English as well. So do come next week if you can, and thank you for being here today.